We're about halfway through the Shop Your Stash summer, and I don't know about you, but I'm getting that feeling. I want something new. Instead of giving in, I'm going to mix things up a bit. This video started out with the idea of building patterns, and it is still that, but it's also about using a mix of new and old school stamping techniques, new and old stamps from my stash, mixing stamps from different companies, and I've got an idea for how to spin your stamps without a spinning tool. For my first pattern, I wanted to build a grid, but I wanted some flexibility. So instead of stamping directly onto a panel, I stamped my pattern onto die-cut squares to almost make tiles. I found a square die that was about the same size as my stamp, and I cut that from the center of a panel. I also cut 12 squares so I could build a 3x4 grid, and then I started stamping. To test my placement, I used some acetate, and then once I had it lined up, I was able to stamp all 12 of my squares in the exact same spot. This is a stamp from a Simon Says stamp set called Geoflower Builder, and I'm stamping with hot tub ink. As I went along, I was finding it difficult to get the square back out of the hole in the panel because it was sticking so well to my grip mat. So I just grabbed my scissors and I snipped off a corner of the panel so that one corner of the area for the die-cut squares was open and easier to grab. Looking at this now, I can see that any open two-sided corner would have worked as well. If you're using a MISTI, that corner is built right in, of course, but this is a way to create a temporary corner if you're stamping with another tool that doesn't have a corner, like this Stamp and Stencil tool. To add some interest to the pattern, I grabbed another stamp from another stamp set that looked like it was about the same size. This stamp set from A Pocket Full of Happiness is an orange peel stamp set that I've never used before. I lined it up over one of my stamp squares and I tested my placement with the acetate in place to be sure that I was happy, and I wasn't. So I moved the stamp and I tested again, and you can do this as many times as you need to be sure you've got it in the exact right place. Then I started stamping that on all 12. Next, I needed some contrast. This was feeling a little too monochrome for me. So same process, I lined up a small circle stamp in the center by using the little white lines in the pattern, and then I stamped all those with sauna ink. Using colors you don't often use is another fun way to feel like you're trying something new. So finally I had my 12 little panels all ready to go. I decided instead of making one big card to break up my patterns a bit. For the first one, I planned to use 4 of them in a mini grid, but I wanted to add a little interest in my background. I grabbed that leaf pattern stencil that I used last week and I used both sides of it to create that pretty floral pattern again, but in a tone-on-tone look this time. You know, in the end, I decided to keep all 3 of those stencils, right? I think most of you agreed with me on that. This background looks almost dimensional behind my 4 floral tiles, and the small dots of yellow really pop. I kept my sentiment small for most of the cards today by using this mini messages set from Mama Elephant on circle die cuts. And I finished all these cards today with a combination of some copper sequins and some golden illusions gems. Now that's only 4 of my 12 tiles though, so here's a look at what else I did before I go back to my idea for spinning without a spinner. I went back to another one of last week's stencils. This one's Geo Circles, which seems to be getting harder and harder to find, but I do have a link below. This stencil is layer 2, the one that fills in the centers of the orange peel pattern. One thing I love about this is that the pattern is sized so that it fits symmetrically on a 4x4 panel. You know, I'm a big fan of symmetry. And if you shift it and then change colors, in the end you get this almost checkerboard pattern, maybe like white flowers with yellow centers on a blue background. This time I put my 2x2 grid on a tilt and I added a bigger sentiment from Avery Elle on a popped up white circle. My next card uses only one tile on a tilt and backed with the frame of On the Lake ink. This was popped up on a white panel that was embossed with the Spellbinders Circle Illusion 3D embossing folder, and then turned over so that the diamonds are flat and the petals are debossed. Next, another one-tile card, but with almost a reversal of the colors. I've got an On the Lake background that was embossed with the Circle Illusion 3D folder and a yellow frame, finished with another Mama Elephant sentiment. Okay, now let's get spinning. I'm starting with a really old favorite, Folksy Florals from Altenew, and I stamped the large flower in the center of my cardstock. After that, I used the design of that flower to help me build my mandala pattern. I started with a single leaf, and let me just put to rest any confusion. Yes, I am using my turntable just to help me trim my paper, but I'm not using a stamp wheel or my stamp and spin tool or even a wreath builder. You can do this just with paper on your work surface. You'll just either have to turn the paper yourself or leave it in place and stamp where you need to. When I finished with the first 6 leaves, that left the perfect amount of space for the smaller flower, and I stamped those as well. I made sure that I had the flower in the same orientation each time, with one petal sticking down into the space between the leaves. Now, to be honest, this is something that the spinning tools don't do very well, which is to stamp in a pattern of 6. They're all really designed for 8-turn designs. And with a floral, there's not a big difference. But if you ever wanted to do, say, a snowflake, it might make a difference to you. Next, I added in a big petal with Skylight ink. This one's from that Simon Says stamp set, and then I felt like this one was done. I grabbed a solid dot stamp and I used some shea butter ink to fill in the centers of my smaller flowers, and then I layered up lots and lots of sauna ink in the center of the larger one. At this point, I realized I didn't have any On the Lake ink on this panel, and it was getting a little too green and less blue, so I decided to take the risk and stamp over those inside small leaves. Honestly, this is just me showing off, but please don't look too closely at that one leaf directly under the sentiment. My background is that layer 2 geo circles again, but this time it's tone on tone with my green and blue inks for a more subtle look. One last card. This time I'm starting with that second stamp from the very first card, which has 4 petals rather than 6. I added in 4 little leaves, and now I've got a square. You could use this pattern and my square die cut idea to build a grid out of it if you wanted. And in fact, I'm leaving this in to show you what I think wasn't the best choice. Because it's such a square, it's hard to build on it. So I started over and I used a dot instead of a leaf this time. This leaves little areas where the point of a leaf can fit and help me build my pattern outward. I tilted each one so that it was pointing away from the blue point from the first image, and that gives a little movement to the design. And it also leaves a bigger space for my next stamp, which is that smaller flower. This time you can see I've got a 2-petal side facing into the leaves. Now you're probably starting to notice that I'm not getting the precision here that I would be getting if I was using my stamp and spin tool, or my wreath builder, or my stamp wheel. Or maybe you're not noticing that at all. This is a great way to get the look without any of the tools. The key to designing this is to choose a center stamp that provides some direction, and as I mentioned, some space for building outwards. Now at this point, I was just playing. I built the pattern out quite a bit, and then here's another idea for making it unique. I started to layer it up. When I filled in the flower centers, I used a dot stamp that was bigger than the hole, so I got the look of a ring around the flower centers. Then I added a dot right into the center, and some to the larger dots around the outside. This is the exact kind of pattern building that I really enjoy. I've got stamps from 3 different companies here, and look how nicely they're all playing together. So here's what it looked like before all the layering, and here's what it looks like now. Just simple shapes and some ink. I love these colors too, but whenever I'm playing like this, I start imagining all the possibilities of different color palettes as well. Okay, it's time to stop. To finish this one, I trimmed it down and I cut a circle from the center with one of my dies that cuts a small frame. I created a mat with a shea butter panel and I put the outside portion directly onto it, and then I popped up the center circle with another little sentiment from Mama Elephant. I didn't want to lose any of that pattern. So, what do you do when you get that feeling? Here's a link to a video that's crammed with ideas for refreshing your crafty stash for free. I've covered a couple of them here today, choosing a fun color scheme, mixing old and new products, but there's lots more that I think you'll enjoy. I'll meet you over there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.